I can have vacuum.
No, I will do.
Okay. All right.
It's for the scavenger hunt, for the resource representatives, the scavenger hunt for the 2012. So you can complete your scavenger hunt, enter it in the drawing to win a free registration for next year.
Why did I pay attention to that?
It was in the newsletter yesterday.
Oh, of course it was.
You can still do it. Yeah, there are two, you have two of your representatives right here. Yes, you have two of us here.
Desert guy. Different place.
All right, well, if everybody doesn't mind, I'd kind of like to get started. I got a lot to go through, and just a little hour to take to do it. So, thank you for coming this morning. I know you had a lot of other very good presentations to choose from, so I appreciate you coming to mine. As it said up front quickly before I get started, part of this presentation revolves around the reproduction of a wax model of a person who had a cheek tumor, and it's in mid-surgery. And so just to be forewarned, it's not that graphic, and it is just a wax model, a picture of a wax model, but just so you be a little forewarned. Merle, if you would close the doors for me. Thank you. My name is John Fino. A little bit about myself before we get started. My website is up there, re-creation.us. If after the presentation you want to learn more about it, you can contact me. Or you want to see some of the other stuff that I've been working on, that's where I would recommend you go. About myself, my full-time job, paying job, is I'm a stay-at-home dad right now. In my meager spare time, I've been working on this project for the last year. I have an undergraduate degree in anthropology and archaeology from Connecticut College. I spent 3 years as an archaeological field technician in the Southwest. Joined the Peace Corps, spent 2 years in Nicaragua, came back to the U.S., worked at the Gibbs Museum here near St. Paul, a historic museum. And then I went to Clemson University for 2 years and got my master's in Parks, Recreation, and Tourism Management. And since then, I have been at home with my 2.5-year-old. We're expecting in January. So, the title of this presentation is Virtual Recreation of Artifacts in Interpretive Spaces using Open Source Software. What does that mean? The major goal of this project was to demonstrate how you could use open source software for interpretation. Now, I dislike, myself personally, the use of technology just because it's cool. There's a lot of flashy stuff out there. You got to use the right tool for the job. And so in this case, I thought, okay, how can I use the technology that I've been working with in an appropriate way in an interpretive setting? So I thought, well, sometimes you have objects or places that are very difficult to bring to the audience that you want. They may be very fragile, so they're hard to display, or they're very complicated to display, or they're too expensive, or they're, in the case of one part of this project, they're too far away, or they don't exist anymore. And so what we can do is we can use different types of open source software to recreate them virtually, or digitally, as I prefer to say. So, and here's your first taste. The first part of this half of this project is to recreate a historic object. And we'll talk more about this wax model. To recreate a historic object that we could manipulate through any web browser in 3D. Now, I don't mean 3D like the blue and red glasses. I mean 3D is on a flat screen, but you can use your mouse to pan and drag and click and zoom in, and we'll look at that. The other half of it, that is dark. Merle, would you, let's see, would you try turning off the overhead and see if we could turn on, was to recreate an environment. So instead of an object that you could manipulate, I think you could turn on some of the overheads, the other ones. I don't want anybody to fall asleep. Okay, I'll keep talking. So instead of creating just an object, yeah, there you go. Perfect. Yeah, so yeah, So it was to create it, instead of an object that you could grab and manipulate as if you're using it in your hands, is an environment that you could walk through. And in this case, it's the what's commonly known as Scott's Hut, the British Antarctic Expedition Hut of the expedition of 1910 to 1914 in Cape Evans in Antarctic. And we'll talk more about that. So here's what we're going to go over today. So there'll be no surprises. We'll talk first about what is open source software, just so that we're all on the same page. Then we'll discuss the wax model from Mayo Clinic. We'll talk about how it was digitized and what it means to digitize something. We'll talk about how then we created the actual model that would be put online and how that model can be displayed online. And then we'll go into the British Antarctic Expedition Hut, Cape Evans. I'll just refer to it as Scott's Hut, it's just quicker. Talk about how I created the environment, how the interaction was created, because it's not just a space that you walk through. People get bored. You have to have a way that people can click on things, manipulate things, things move, things make sound. And then we'll talk about publishing. So essentially, you have your environment that you've created, you're very proud of it, you want to show people. So there are many different ways, and there are many different considerations. And then conclusions, and I'd ask you to hold your questions and comments to the end. I will try to get us through everything to get about 10 minutes worth of questions and comments at the end. So first, let's look at what is open source software. And when we talk about open source software, we're talking about free software. Free as in freedom. So the Free Software Foundation has a definition that I particularly like of open source software because of its succinctness. It describes open source software as it gives you the freedom to run the program for any purpose. The license that you get with the software doesn't say, okay, you can only use this for private purposes, or only commercial, or only educational. You can use it in any environment that you choose. You can also study the program and change it. So if you have the wherewithal, you can take this software, and if you want to make something really cool out of it, you can go ahead. You can look at their source code, you can program it, do whatever you like with it. There are changes that you want to make, bugs that you want to fix. Knock yourself out. You can redistribute copies. And that is to say, oftentimes you'll buy a license for a closed source piece of software. You're allowed to use it on one computer. Maybe you bought a license for 3, 4, 5 computers. Open source software says, use it on as many computers as you like. Send it to your friend in Miami. Let them use it. You can redistribute the copies as you like. And you are also free to distribute the version that you modified. So if you did make changes to the software, you can go ahead and distribute those too, as you like. Quickly, we'll talk about what is good about open source software. Open source software can be very powerful. And by that I mean, for example, one of the programs that we use heavily in this presentation is called Blender. And it can do a whole lot of stuff, and you're going to see that later. Many open source software programs can do quite a bit of things. Non-restrictive, like we just talked about, you have the freedom to use the software as you like. And so you're not restricted by the license and how you can use it. Low cost. So we talked about free software, free as in freedom. Now we can talk about free software, free as in free beer. And that's the, they like to say, free as in freedom, free as in beer. In that, most open source software does not cost you anything. You can charge for open source software if you want. Most open source software organizations have a different model, generally donation-based, that they get their funding from. So most open source software won't cost you anything. But I think this is the most important part about open source software is the community that you get. So open source software, oftentimes, so let's take for example Blender. There's the Blender Foundation and they have a crew of maybe 5, 10, I think people permanently working full-time who are actually paid to work on Blender software. There are hundreds of community volunteer members who fix bugs, who create add-ons, who do all sorts of things because they love the software. But they're not just interested in supporting the software to make the software better, they're also interested in making sure that other people have access to it and understand how to use it. If you have problems, you can generally go to the community for it. So there's a very strong, powerful user base, as well as developer base, that supports other users. And the bad, it's not all rainbows and sunshine. Sometimes you will get open source software that is bleeding edge. Open source software oftentimes is people doing projects because they really want to do that project. They have a technology like, I have this problem and I need to solve it. and they create a piece of software and they open source the code for it. Oftentimes it's bleeding edge, one step more than cutting edge. So you may find that because it's so experimental, it often has stability issues. There are bugs in it that may get ironed out when you need them to, they may not. Not all open source software is bleeding edge. Many of them are not. Many of them are very, very stable, as stable as any commercial software that you might find. License conflicts. Now, we've talked about how Blender software is open. You can use it for wherever you want. You have the freedom to use it. However, if we take, for example, Blender has a game engine. So if you want to create a game, really cute little game, jumping, bouncing, hopping, whatever you want to do it, and you want to publish it on Apple's iOS environment. So the operating system that runs iPad, that runs the iPhone. You can't use the Blender game engine. You can't publish that game. You have to use a different game engine. Because Apple's ecosystem is very, very, very closed. That's how they keep control of everything that goes on. And so the license for Blender conflicts with the Apple license. So it's another thing to take into account when you're developing. Oftentimes, these are small projects. Blender Foundation is a very big project. However, you will oftentimes find software that you like that's created by one person, 2 people. They're not paid generally. And so you may not get the support that you're looking for. However, you get the flip side of that, is that sometimes they're so excited that someone is using their software that they're more than happy to help you figure out how to use it, iron out any bugs with you. As well as focus change, because they're doing this voluntarily almost all the time. They're not developing it because you have a need and you're going to pay them for it. They're developing because they have a need, they have an interest. And so maybe you use this software and you really like it, and the next time they put out another version of it, it's going in a completely different direction. I've had that happen to me too. Because it's how they want to do it. Now, if you know how to program, you can take the original source code and do what you want with it. But if you don't, you're sometimes stuck. And sometimes they'll abandon the software altogether because they want to go work on something else, or because they didn't like doing it, or because they got a job. So now we know a little bit about open source software. We'll talk about the wax models. We'll just go ahead and jump right in here. These are teaching models. The Mayo Clinic, if you're familiar with Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, world famous. But before we had modern technology, like all this stuff I got sitting up here, if you wanted to teach your students what a particular disease looked like, or if you wanted to teach them how to do a specific type of, say, injection method, but you didn't want to have to keep injecting someone over and over until they got it, or you didn't want to have to bring that person's tumor in every time you needed to show it to them, what they would do is they would hire artists, and they would create these wax models and other different types of material, but all the human parts were always made out of wax. And they are works of art. And the Mayo Clinic has, I think, something like 2,000 of these objects. Some are in very good shape, some are on display. Many are in storage, as is the case with so many objects. And so I have a colleague, Christy Van Hoven, who works at Mayo Clinic Historic Archives. And we work together to figure out, how can we take these objects and bring them to a wider audience, but not actually have to pull them out of the boxes more than a couple of times? So what we actually wanted to do was take this object, our first example, this medical wax model, and we wanted to be able to put it into a form that could be displayed on a web browser that people could go to online and manipulate it as if they were standing in front of it. So it needs to be photorealistic. So we'll start with what I tried first, because I'd never done this before. I assumed I could do it, so hey. And that's the beauty of open source software. We'll talk about that in a minute. I started out by trying a reference image. So essentially just taking a picture of the object, front, side, top, putting it into Blender, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, how you can send, I just tried tracing around the edge, creating a 3D model just from pictures. It didn't work. For the simple reason of parallax. Anybody know what parallax is? Say you're sitting in a car, right? Sitting in a car, you're driving 60 miles an hour. You're a good law-abiding citizen. You're doing 60 miles an hour, and the needle says, you have an analog needle, and it's pointed to 60. And you see it says 60 miles an hour. The person sitting next to you looks over to that needle. It doesn't say 60 miles an hour to them. It says 57, 58. That's parallax. Essentially, you're seeing the same object, what's behind it, from 2 different directions. And so the overall geometry of the object looks different from 2 different perspectives. And so every time I tried to do one side, I turned it to the other side, and then the geometry fit. So good to start with the simple things first. So I moved on to what's called laser scanning, because it sounds cool. Laser scanning is a pretty simple technology. I used a software called Maker Scanner. Any of the software that I talk about here today, you'll be able to go to my website and have the links for all of this. And you'll be able to play with them. It's pretty fun. Essentially all I used was a webcam, a line laser. Now I hacked this out in my basement. Maker Scanner sells these nice 3D printed models, and you put the lasers in and it's all nice for you. All you really need is the distance from here to here, and then you need a flat reference surface behind it, and you can go ahead and you can drag the laser right across the object, and the software triangulates the surface, the 3D surface. And it outputs, I did not put this thing down. It outputs a point cloud. And what a point cloud is, it's essentially a whole collection of geometric points that represent one spot on the object. Now, the problem we had with laser scanning was that you could only scan one face at a time. So we have an object that has 6 dimensions, 6 degrees of freedom, but we only scan one face at a time. Well, that's fine. There's a piece of software called MeshLab where you can actually stitch the pieces together to create the whole thing again. What happened was the pieces didn't fit. So they looked good. They looked like they really should fit. But when you ran it through the software, it said, no, the geometry of one is just a little different shape than the other one. And so that meant that the laser scanning wasn't being accurate enough to recreate the whole thing. And before we go on, does everybody know what a polygon is? Mm-hmm. So just real quick, we can tell what I'm talking about. Geometric point, right? Let's say, like on here, we have all these points. We can take 3 of them, fill it in, we have a triangle. Or, if you have 4 in whatever shape you need, and you fill it in, you have a polygon. You put a whole bunch of these together, and you have a polygon mesh. So before we go any further, just so you know what I'm talking about when I talk about points versus polygon meshes. Okay, so this didn't work. It was good to try. It was fun. So the next thing I tried was a technology called structured light scanning. And it sounds really cool, but it's essentially incredibly simple. And all it is, the only technology you need is a projector, just like that, and a camera. You set the lens of the camera immediately over the lens of the projector. You set the object up in front of it, and you have 3 images. Repeating black and white bars. There's a grayscale in between them. And you have one image that you project, take a picture. Next one, picture. Next one, picture. So you end up with 3 images of of these bars in 3 different positions. Put them into the software. In this case, I used a program called 3-Phase. And what it does is it can read the depth of that object, which is nice. And it put out a pretty nice object. Again, the problem was we're only doing one face at a time. And so in this case, the software is, they're actually moving this software to do real-time 3D. Are you familiar with the Kinect from Microsoft, the Xbox Kinect? That does this. That does structured light scanning, but it's infrared, so you can't see it. And what it's doing is it's measuring the depth of you in real time to interact with the machine. The problem was with this, if you're doing just still images, you have to adjust the depth by eye, manually. So you're never exactly sure, is it the proper depth for this object? So again, when I tried to stitch the pieces together, they didn't quite fit. So I needed a software that could do the whole thing at once. That would just make my life so much easier. And I found it. It's a technology called photogrammetry. And actually in this case, we're using parallax, which messed me up to begin with. We're using parallax to our advantage. Are you familiar with digital elevation models? So essentially terrain models that tell you the elevation of the terrain. They fly planes at an altitude over it, and they take pictures. They take those pictures, and they use photogrammetry to recreate the 3D surface. But in this case, we're doing close-range photogrammetry. The only technology you need, the only piece of equipment you need, is a camera. You don't even need a very fancy camera. Now, it's not that simple. There are a lot of little details that I found out later, but to start with, you can take your camera, and let's say you have an object that you want to recreate. You simply walk around the object, and you take a picture every 5 degrees or so. You may get all the way around, 360 degrees, 70 to 80 photographs. You upload it into the software. Now, in this case, Arc3D is the software that I use that you'll see the results of in this. Arc3D is not open source. It is a free-to-use piece of software, but it's licensed as you cannot use the results commercially. So again, we have licensing restrictions with non-open source software. There is, however, one that I've been experimenting with and I have very good hopes for called PPTGUI, Python Photogrammetry Toolbox Graphical User Interface. It does the same thing, but you don't have to upload it to a web service, as with Arc3D. It just lives on your computer, and you can do the calculations locally. So what we came up with for Arc3D was this. Now, Arc3D doesn't just give you, it can give you a point cloud. It gives you the data to create a point cloud, or it'll actually give you a polygon mesh to begin with. It'll give you a very high polygon mesh, or a simplified one, which was nice. The downside to photogrammetry is the results you get are enormous. Because what it's done is it's said, okay, between these two pictures, okay, that point on the object looks the same as this point. Okay, so that must be the same point, and it looks for it each time, and it uses parallax to reconstruct where it is in three-dimensional space. But it's taking points from all over the model. And so the file that you could use to recreate the point cloud was 1.5 gigabytes. And as a download, that's a long, I mean, reasonable internet, but, and then you take that. This one here was, I think, somewhere over 500,000 faces, 500,000 triangles, which it's not going to work. It's just too big. The simplified version of it was much smaller, but I didn't really care for the results here. So, we're going to take our point cloud. This is just an example. This is not actually the output from Arc3D, but this is a simple example that is easy to see. So let's say we have our photogrammetry point cloud. We'll take that and we're going to put it into a program called MeshLab. Again, open source. MeshLab is a very powerful program, but it can take a little getting used to. There are finally some good tutorials online for this. What MeshLab can do is you can run a filter and it says, okay, got all these points. I'm going to make a whole bunch of triangles out of it. It's going to make 68,000 triangles. Again, it's too much. There's too many. So what MeshLab can then do is it can simplify to a low polygon mesh, because even that many faces, 68,000 faces, when we put it in the next piece of software, it's going to just bog down. And I have a pretty powerful computer, and it's still bogging it down. So we got our low polygon mesh. And what it does is what's called decimation. It simplifies the amount of faces, and you don't lose much resolution on it. So we have our 30,000 faces. Now, we're going to move from MeshLab to Blender. But when we do that move, and this is the actual Arc3D output, when we do that move, we lose our color information. But you know what? We're better off. Because you saw the color before, it looked okay, but it wasn't photorealistic. And what we want to do is the first step we're going to do in Blender is we want to do what's called retopology. You can see this guy's face. He's got all the little triangles. It's a little messy. There are ways to smooth that, but then you start losing the overall geometry, and it's just not nice. So what we can do is, now that we can have the object in Blender, we can do what's called retopology. So essentially all we're doing is we take the object, and it's almost like taking some shrink wrap and just snapping it right to the object. So let's say, for example, we draw a line along this edge here in the Blender virtual 3D space, and then each of these points that we extrude from it snaps to the geometry. And so this way, carefully, we can bring down 30,000 faces to 2,000. And now we have an object that is actually manipulatable online with most computers. But now we need our color back. And this is where it gets really cool. This was my favorite part. I didn't know about this till I started doing this. Blender has a technique called projection painting, where you have your images, your original pictures. You can actually paint them, like an airbrush paint them, right onto the 3D geometry. And so you say, okay, all these faces, you assign them pretty much, you correlate them to the photograph. and then you can just simply start painting. It doesn't give you the whole face. So what we can do is then take another photograph and assign it to the next set of faces and paint right on there. Now, it's not that simple. There is quite a bit of art to this step of the process. But you end up with the actual photograph right on the model. And so we have our photorealism that we're after. But now we got to get it online. So we're going to export it to what's called .x3d file format. And this is a type of file that can be read online, but not directly. What we have to do is we have to use a technology called X3DO, and I think they pronounce it freedom. It doesn't look like freedom to me, but that's how they say it's pronounced. So we take our X3D file, and we put it in next to our HTML, our web page, right? So your web page, the code is only about this long. I mean, it's just like 10 lines long. And in the HTML, it says, okay, next to this web page, there's an X3D file, all right? And it uses what's called inline nodes. And so it says, okay, so here's this file, and then you're going to go to this website, this particular address, and it will then tell the browser how to read the file in the web browser. It's actually fairly simple and straightforward. And we can have a look at this. And so, my apologies, this is not actually live because there's no Wi-Fi in here. So this is a screen capture of it in the browser. And actually, we've lost some resolution here. It actually looks much nicer than this on the web browser. Go to my website. You can actually see the thing live. So you can click, pan, drag with the left mouse button, middle mouse button pans, excuse me. And then you can use the scroll to zoom in and out. And so we can manipulate the object quite happily in 3D. The downside to this is that it uses a technology called WebGL. And WebGL is an open format, and so of course, Microsoft won't support it. If you use Safari, you're good to go. Use Chrome, good to go. Firefox, no problem. Internet Explorer, problem. They are working on a way to use this, to route this through Flash. So we don't have any problems running it on any browser. It's not perfect yet, but they're getting there. And so in a fairly short time, we'll be able to view things like this on any web browser. And so we have our final output. Lessons learned from this part. You can do this. I can do this. You can do this. It simply takes time and a bit of perseverance. I had no budget for this, just me. And that was the beauty of the open source software, was that if I found a technology and I wanted to try it, I could. I didn't have to buy it. I wasn't restricted with what I could do with it, and I could try a different technology as I left. But you have to consider three major things when you're doing this sort of thing. One is the object materials. Let's say you want to use the laser scanning. If your object is matte, like fur, the laser will be directly absorbed into the material, reflect nothing back, and it can't scan it. Photogrammetry, if the object is very, very plain, very simple. So let's say you had a smooth surface, no bumps, no shadows, no color. It has no points defined. So photogrammetry can have a very hard time with that type of surface. So you can imagine it doesn't do a very good job with reflective objects, because then all of a sudden the color changes from picture to picture, depending on how it's reflected. You can't use transparent objects. Same problem again. So a lot of those things can be cured if you want to use structured light scanning. And there are closed source structured light scanners and laser scanners that I believe are quite accurate. I haven't used them, but I've seen some nice results from them. And then you've got to worry about topology and lighting. So one of the objects that we're working on now is an injection. So it's the arm from here to here. It's a glass syringe, an actual glass syringe, two wax hands like this and this. If you know anything about the topology of the hand, the human hand, it's insane. It's incredibly complicated. It changes even with just the littlest movement. And so these two hands are very different, and you shine lights on them, and there's shadows everywhere. Wax, depending on how you make it, can be reflective. Wax can absorb the light too. So much of what you're going to do is going to be considered of the object, what it's shaped like, and how you light it. And that will affect the results that you get. So if you had, for example, just a vase and had lots of nice paintings, drawings on it, you could use photogrammetry, pop it into Blender, you'd be done in no time. Very simple, simple object. So let's go on to the pen. All right. Would you turn the lights on me for me? Turn all the lights on. And everybody else just for a second. Because that was a lot. Yeah. And we have a lot left to go. So, if everybody just kind of stand up for a second. Stretch out. Make sure you got oxygen flowing everywhere that you need it to be. How we do? Perfect. All right. You can sit down again. I just wanted to get everybody. All right. So we're going to talk next about the environment that I worked on. First, we're going to introduce you to Blender. Blender is a supremely incredible piece of technology, especially being free and open source. Blender can do very detailed and very realistic, or not realistic, depending on how you want to do it, modeling, sculpting of objects. You can render those objects, so you can render them as a still image. Blender, every year, more or less, they do an open movie or an open project where it's an open source short animation. So I highly recommend you go to their website. They have a lot of incredible animations that they've done. And so you can do animations rendering, you can do rigging skeletons, because you're going to need to do that if you want to do your animation. You can do skinning and rigging, so you can do facial animations, all sorts of stuff. It has a compositor, so you can do post-production effects. You don't need Adobe, you don't need what's it called? Premiere. You can do this with Blender. You can also do during production effects with this too. The compositor and the node system that Blender has is developing very quickly and is coming a long way. Blender can also do physics simulations. It has part of it is called, it uses the bullet physics library, so we can simulate water, we can simulate bricks. You can do all sorts of very cool stuff. But the part of Blender we're going to talk about here today is the Blender Game Engine. One of the years, they did an open game because they wanted to test the game engine. They wanted to improve it. And so they worked very, very hard on the game engine. They created a game with a little squirrel that beats up sheep. It's a long story. For that, they needed to be able to do animations. So you can see there's the squirrel jumping up on a rock. He can pull himself up. All of this done in real time. Physics and particle simulations, real time. So you can simulate water going on a wheel. You can simulate water flowing over an object in real time. Now you see it's just little balls. But when they actually do the rendering of it, you can use water. It just uses balls as part of the library. But to do all this, there's two ways to create this sort of interaction in Blender. We can do the classic programming. In Blender, we use Python for scripting. It's a programming language. And that's essentially typing in the commands that you want the computer to do. Blender also has a nifty little thing called logic bricks they've had for some time. And it's a graphical way of creating logic. And we'll look at that in a little bit towards the end here. So, let's see if I can make this work. Now you'll notice I have two computers here. My laptop over here does not have a graphics card that will run this game, or this environment. And we'll explain the why in a minute. This computer...
Will you readjust that? Yeah, the projector just got turned.
Oh, did I? Thank you.
Thank
you. My wife's Mac does not have enough RAM, enough memory to run this, and the presentation software, and the video we saw. So, I had to make do. Hopefully, this will work out well for me. Would you hit the lights again, Ron, please? That does not look very good. So, let's try it. That's still not quite right. Let's try. There we go. That looks pretty good. So, let's pray this works. So I'm not used to using my wife's Mac. And so essentially, this piece of software, when I had it a little more finalized, you'll be able to download a zip file, double-click on a file in it, and it will just simply run it for you. We're actually seeing the Blender environment around it, but you wouldn't normally see that. Now sound. My apologies that you can't see the mouse. It's a scripting error that I need to fix. Again, this is a work in progress. But you can mouse over the buttons, give you different information. You can see they get bigger and smaller, you get a little noise. We click on Enter the HUD, and the first thing you get, let's hope, is a bit of information, historical background about the hut, about the place. I won't bore you with that, though I think it's pretty interesting. Just kind of setting the scene, giving people kind of sense of place for it, and then finally a little a bit of information on how to move through the environment itself. We left click. Now on my wife's Mac, if I hadn't loaded this once already today, we'd be sitting here for another 5 minutes. Because the hut interior, I wanted to make it fairly realistic, which means you need a fairly beefy computer, but it does run on a MacBook. Hopefully it will not take 5 minutes again. And if it does, we'll move on. All right.
How much time did it take to get to this point in your manipulations? Like weeks,
Well,
months, years?
I found out about, that's a good time, let's answer some questions in the meantime. Thank you. I found out that there was going to be the NAI conference, the national conference in St. Paul, about a little over a year ago. I was like, oh, cool, and I've been working with some of this technology. I was like, I'll put together a presentation. I didn't know how to do any of this before then. So it's taken about a year to learn all of this stuff and to create it. So the actual workflow now would be much, much faster. I couldn't give an exact time. It's a lot of it's going to depend on what you recreate.
Did you use Macs for the whole process? Or
No, I didn't use Macs at all. I actually used Windows. Windows 7. I have a big tower at home because while you can run this on Macs, it goes a little slower. You can run it on some of these projects, but it's easier to create the environment when you have a lot of power behind you. It just simply makes everything go a little faster. Yes?
Besides my personal limitation,
Yes.
shareware, freeware, all that stuff,
Uh-huh.
government computers, there's no such thing as shareware or freeware on a government computer.
Why?
You have to have a license. What?
Now, it does come with a license. Open source software is licensed to you. It's not a thing, but it has a specific type of open license.
So I still need to get it approved. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I need to go through my IT guy and they gotta look at it and say, okay, so
Okay.
I'm gonna truck our other programs and stuff like that.
Okay.
That's fine, that's a hurdle I gotta do, that's great.
Okay.
But even if that were the case, and I broke all the rules and did it at home,
Yes.
once the product is complete, just like a photo is complete,
Uh-huh.
much simpler, can I bring that and put it into my
Yes.
website?
Yes.
Is that something that?
Yes. That's a
is an
very
object
good
that I
question.
can use?
There are things called viral licenses. Blender actually uses what is sometimes derogatorily called a viral license. So the Blender game engine is licensed under GPL. I don't know what it stands for. But that says that if you use the Blender game engine, if you bundle it, see what you output is what's called a .blend, it's just the file format. That is your own personal copyright. You can sell it, you can open source it, you can never show it to anybody, you do whatever you want with it, you're not restricted. But if you bundle it directly in with the game engine, now everything that's in your .blend has to be open source too because of the license. But you'll see in a minute a way around that. And it's pretty simple. Okay, so we have our environment, and we can take the mouse, and we can look around, look up, look down. We have a little magnifying glass. That's our center. And then we can use the arrow keys, the WASD keys to move. Sure, we can hear that double footsteps in the background. Hover over an object. You can get the name pop up. Left click. We to get a little more information about the person who slept there. Right click on it. It goes away. And then we can walk through the environment. We can walk around, and all the bunks at this point have the name of the person who slept there. And then, for example, we can walk over and we can check out the gramophone. Again, we can left click on it, up pops an overlay screen, gives some basic information about it. And as you see at the bottom, it tells you if you press the toggle the P key, you can play and not play the song. So we'll right click on here and press P. There we go. And so we get sound. The really cool thing about some of the newer versions of Blender, oh, I got my speakers backwards. But we have 3D sound. So one speaker, as if you were hearing it one ear to the other. We walk. Okay, my speaker down. We walk away, and it gets more quiet. Come back. We also use a simple animation running. That's why I don't use these speakers anymore. But we have the record player. You can't really see it. Well, if you're interested later, I'll move it up. You can see it a little better on the screen. It's just not bright enough on here. The record spins, proper RPMs, a little arm bounce up and down, and it moves in as the record plays. So you can do a lot of, you can do very complicated animations. You can do very simple animations.
I was never a sailor, but some time ago.
So, that was George Roby from 1908.
I'm trying to, in my head, I'm trying to think. You use Blender with your first scenario of the wax faces and all that stuff. But then I'm trying to come back the other way. Did you use Blender for that first project, but did you use any of the elements of the process in the first project to develop this? Or was all of that created within Blender?
All of that was created within Blender and GIMP. And we'll go through actually how this was created in a minute. But that's a good question. Like the scanning technologies, no, were not used for this because I've never been to Antarctica. If anybody knows anybody who wants to invite me, I'd be happy to go. But no, I've never actually been there. So let's see here quickly.
Because that's pretty intriguing. I mean, I've done
Did you die?
games and animations and stuff like that before.
Okay.
But I'm curious to see how the process of creating something like that goes.
So the process then is
that a good transition to
It was an excellent transition. Thank you very much. We start out with research. If you don't know what you're making, you're not going to get very far. Then we'll go to the mesh modeling, actually creating the virtual solid surfaces that you see. Then we need to give them their color, shadows. We need to light them so they look nice. And then you need to add the game logic. Essentially, is how do we get those little things to pop up when we mouse over them? How do we get the record player to turn and play the sound when you want it to? And then finally, the exporting or publishing. How do we get it to our audience? So we'll start with researching the hut. I used some of the original. I was very lucky with this particular expedition because they brought a camera artist with them. And he took some spectacular photos, outside and inside, which was very, very helpful in locating objects. Modern photos also helped quite a bit, but there had been several expeditions use this afterwards. As well, I used Scott's journals, so there's quite a bit been written about this. There's a lot of first-hand information as well as second-hand information. So now we know where things are, so let's take, for example, the gramophone. It is again made up of triangles and polygons. It's a very simple surface. This particular model, I think, had 400 or 500 faces, which is not bad. The entire model has between, I think, about 12,500 faces. So the more faces you have, the slower it's going to run. So you want to make everything as simple as possible, but not so simple that it looks like a square. And so you shape everything, you model everything. We won't get into the modeling of that because that's a 2 hours in and of itself.
Quick point of clarification.
Yes.
You're saying faces, are you referring to the particular
Yes.
titles or actual, okay.
Every polygon, so you see here a black dot.
Yes.
That represents the center of the face. So every triangle and every polygon in Blender counts as a face.
Okay, I just.
You can't see it up here, but it always gives you a count of faces in the object. It also gives you a count of vertices, which are the geometric points in the corner that make it up, as well as the points. Thank you. So, we have our model. Anybody ever done origami? Folded a paper airplane? It's similar to this. So essentially what we've done is we've taken a two-dimensional flat surface and we've folded it. And we folded it to create a three-dimensional surface. But we want to put texture on it. So what we can do is, this particular texture was created in GIMP. If you're familiar with Photoshop, this is the open source version of it. And it's photographs that have color, and you say, okay, I'm going to take this object, I'm going to unfold it. Everything that's going to get this color is going to get laid flat here. You need to stretch it and make it look nice. Everything that's going to have the brass is going to get laid here. The record's going to get laid here. The wood on the side. And so you've essentially unfolded it, laid it flat, and assigned it a texture. And then when you look at it again, you have your colored texture. There's another neat little trick. You can see here, this is the door to the darkroom, and it has a hinge on it, but it's flat. Literally, it's flat. It's just one polygon face. What we can do is we can have what's called a normal map. What the normal map does is it tells the game engine, okay, since your lights are here, make this reflect in this manner so that it kind of pops out. And so you can see the difference. Flat, not flat. But it's still the same amount of faces. And so it saves us quite a bit of processing power. Yeah. And so then what you use is, this is essentially the color texture that the computer interprets to create that sense of 3D when it's still completely flat. And it's a matter of the lighting interacting with this particular texture. Lighting and shading. If you've ever done photography, you know that lighting is probably the most important thing, and it is here too. So this is Blender with all those color textures in single texture. You can also do multi-texture laid on each other. Looks okay, but it's kind of static, it's kind of boring. We can use what's called GLSL technology. And when we saw that normal map, that relies on GLSL. You turn this into that. And so you get the nice shadows, you have the lighting reflecting off things properly. It just makes everything seem much more realistic. It gives a lot more detail to objects too. The problem is, like as I was saying, my little laptop here doesn't have a graphics card that is GLSL compatible. Fortunately, my wife's does. Most modern computers that have a what's called discrete graphics card, instead of one that's built right in, they have their own discrete one, can do GLSL. So it's generally not a problem, but it's something to take into consideration depending on how you're going to use your IT environment.
What was GLSL?
It's what's called a shader. It's a way of telling the computer how to shade things. So if you looked closely in the game at this table, you would see as you moved around, it looked like the reflections were reflecting off little scratches and marks like that weren't actually there in the geometry. So then we look into the game logic. The game logic, this is the bricks that I was talking about. So for example, the one bump we moused over and then clicked on, it has simple logic that says, okay, mouse over. When the mouse is over, this object is visible. When the mouse is not over, it's not visible. Not all game logic is that simple. This is very simple stuff. As you get more complicated, this can turn into an absolute bowl of spaghetti. And so you may need to then think about learning how to script. And in my opinion, you can only go so far with game logic. Eventually, when you want to do more complicated things, more interesting things, it's important to learn how to script, how to program. And there are lots and lots and lots of tutorials out there about how to do scripting in Blender. That same scripting is what allows the animations and the sounds to play. So the logic says, okay, when you click on it, when the sound is playing, we're going to have this, we're going to play this particular animation, and at the same time, we're going to play the animation of the arm, and the sound will play for a certain amount of time, and at the end, it will all stop. And if you press P, it starts, P again, it stops. Now publishing. This particular one you can see is running on a Mac. I can also run it on Windows because I'm running it in Blender. Blender can run on Mac, Windows, Linux. But when you want to publish it, as someone asked about the license, you need to be a little careful. So what I've done here is I've had an example of how to publish it on Windows. I haven't quite figured it out on Mac yet, or Linux, but again, it's a work in progress. So this is what your data folder would look like. You'd have all tons of these DLL libraries. We'd have this important thing, Blender Player, which essentially is a stripped down version of Blender. Now remember, like I said before, if you bundle the two together, your .blend, which is the environment itself, if you bundle them and actually smush them together, you'd have to open source your output, your product. But in this case, they're just simply side by side. But you don't want to give this to your audience. They will look at you and you think you're insane. It's just a mess. So what we can do then is, this data folder here is this. And so then we can run a simple script that says, change the directory to the data folder, and then Blender Player, play this .blend. And so then the user simply clicks on that, and off it goes. It's fairly simple. And now we've avoided all the licensing conflicts that we might have otherwise had, and you can go ahead and sell this. If you're worried that someone who has a copy of Blender can come in and sneak in and steal your textures and your models, most people don't do this. Not that common. But if you are worried, there are ways to encrypt that blend so that it cannot be opened in Blender and only in Blender Player. But in this case, I'm not terribly worried. So finally, lessons learned. It's no small effort. There are some big games coming out right now, and these big game companies, they have hundreds of people working on the initial creation. They have hundreds of people as support, and they spend tens of millions of dollars to create these games. But this is not bad for a guy down in his basement with no budget. It's just simply a matter of time, and that's open source software helps. You can start with the logic bricks. If you're scared of programming, as I am, you can start with the logic bricks and do a nice graphical interface, but eventually you'll start to realize that you will need to do more interesting and more powerful things, and you'll want to learn how to program, how to script. And know your target machines, as we've discussed. If you're going to have this, say, in a museum, and you know exactly what type of machine it's going to run on, then you can just simply load it up and make sure everything works fine. But if you're going to make this available for download, because eventually I will have this, you're going to need to specify to people, okay, you're going to need this much RAM. You're going to need this, you're going to need a processor that can do GLSL graphics. Things like that. So if you know your machine can't run GLSL, that'll influence how you create the environment itself. So finally, conclusions. I did open source software simply because I needed the flexibility, both monetarily and in terms of what software I could use, to experiment a lot of different ways to try to recreate these objects. As well, the open source software was a good way to start creating a learning environment like this. Now, open source software can't do everything, but it is powerful enough and flexible enough that you can start experimenting with what you want to do, and you don't have to feel constrained by money. You don't have to feel constrained by your license on it. So, mercifully, that is the end. Would you put the lights on? If you have any more questions, comments, feel free to ask.
Everything you showed us in Blender was fairly static. The only movement that we saw was the record player, was record turning.
Yes.
Can you recreate animals or people
Yep.
in that environment too?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can they take movement or life or something to that effect? Or is that a fairly...
Yeah, when you start getting into like artificial intelligence, that's a much higher. You will need to learn how to script. It's fairly complicated. If you've ever played any, even modern computer games, the AI, the artificial intelligence, is quite good, but you'll always find something that it's not quite realistic. So you can use Python to script artificial intelligence, and there are tutorials out there that tell you how to get started with that. Yes, you can do lots of animations. Anything you can do in a game, you can do in the Blender game engine.
Even, because what I'm thinking of
Yes.
is if we're doing that facility, kids may come up on it, and that's on a surgery table or radiation or something like that. So it might be an animal that's not moving or something that,
Right. Yes, absolutely. You can do fairly complicated animations. Obviously, the more you add to a scene, the harder it is on the computer processor, but I'd say go check out the Blender website and check out the open project, the open game, Yo Frankie from 2008. They have a lot of very complicated animal animations of them walking, facial expressions, picking things up, jumping, climbing, grabbing. Those are all things that you can do using the constraint system, the rigging, the skeletal system that you can use in the game engine itself. It's not simple. There's no doubt about it. Rigging is some of the hardest stuff to do. Animation rigging, especially, the human face is just a nightmare. You've heard of the uncanny valley, where essentially it says, if you have cutesy, cartoony things, people look at it and think, oh, that's nice. But the more realistic you get, the more creeped out people get.
yeah.
And there's this valley. And you get down to the bottom of that valley, and if you've seen some of the 3D animations they try to make it realistic, that people just look dead. And so there's this huge slog, and I don't think anybody's really come out of it yet, to get up to a point where people can look at what's supposed to be a realistic face and say, okay, yeah, I believe that. I'm not freaked out by this person, moving like a human but looking like a zombie. So.
I was hoping you could comment a little bit about the difference in how complicated it is between nature scenes and like human-made areas. Like, 'cause I noticed like a lot of very simple geometry with like boxes and things like that, but when you do like a forest,
it's a whole different ball of wax. Absolutely, because you're then dealing with between like the boxes that you saw, which have 4 faces, and you're done. When you do the complex geometry like trees and things like that, you have to cut some corners. Oftentimes you can do like a tree, and it's essentially a cutout, but it follows you wherever you look. So it always looks like you're looking at the front of the tree. That's the cheapest way to do it. There are couple of different tricks that you can do that sort of thing. People are really starting to, the technology is starting to get to the point where it's much more realistic, but that's sort of organic, with lots of different faces and textures and technology, textures and shapes, is harder and much more complicated to do. And so you're constrained in a lot of different ways in terms of how big you can make the space, how many trees you can have, and things like that. Does that answer? Yeah. Okay. Yes?
What would be your base operating system for you getting started on?
It doesn't matter. Blender can do anything. I use Windows 7. You can use Windows 95. Blender will run off a thumb drive. Blender will run off a USB drive. Blender is about not necessarily clicking a button and all of a sudden things magically happen. It's about you learning how things work, and so it's lightweight, but it's very, very, I don't want to say complicated, but there's a lot of things that you can do with the tool. So, if it's all I had was my wife's MacBook, something like that, absolutely, you could get started. If you want to do big environments, if you want to do, there are people using Blender now to do very incredibly photorealistic nature scenes, static, or environment, that I've looked at and it looks like water. It's amazing. But you will need a powerful computer, and oftentimes you need to use if you do just animations and not game like this, you'll need to use what's called a render farm, where essentially many different computers try to render the same animation, because sometimes with photorealistic stuff, it can take 3 to 4 minutes to render one frame. And if you have an animation, this is why all the Blender open movies or animations are about 8 to 10 minutes long. And it takes weeks to render them. Some of the render farms that they use at Pixar are the size of 10 of these rooms. I mean, they have just hundreds of computers working in parallel to render all these scenes. But the technology is getting better. Every year, it gets a little easier to do this stuff at home, which is kind of cool. Was there another question? Yes, sir.
You probably sort of answered it, but I was wondering how detailed you can get with the software within the scripting. I know with Maya, for instance, if you have fur on an animal, you have a slider that tells you how long the fur is, how thick the fur is, how much wind you want on it, blowing on it to wave the fur around.
Right.
Maya does all the scripting for you. It makes the fur blow in the wind.
Right. You can.
M-A-Y-A?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's like one of the leading closed source sort of 3D content creation suites. It's very powerful. It's incredible piece of technology. Blender can do the same thing. You can script it if you want. You can program it into Python. But Blender uses what's called a particle system, where essentially the particles are hairs. hair follicles. And so then you can determine how thick it is, how many you want. And it is, again, it's a graphical interface to do that. It's separate from the game engine bricks itself. If you want to do that sort of thing in animation or even in the game engine, it's a different panel. But it is a graphical interface to that. I haven't done fur yet, so I can't speak too heavily to it. But yes, it's not the same as Maya, but it can do things similar to it. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Yeah, it was a number of years ago, I'm not sure what technology or program you used, but at Smithsonian, they were doing 3D images of objects you could manipulate.
Mm-hmm.
And probably 7, 8 years ago. But they actually did P-51 fighter.
Okay.
You could flip around, look at every rivet,
Cool.
fly into it, and look in the engine compartment as you approach the plane. That's blending the two technologies, because it's like walking through that room. It's actually.
Yeah, and any of the the software that I use to show the head online is specifically to show it online. Like literally, I cannot have that HTML file offline.
Okay.
It doesn't run. It has to have a web connection. But you can use Blender. I can take that head in Blender and do a very similar thing using logic, using game logic and cameras.
Okay.
So yes, you can do all that in Blender, but it's more difficult to get done online. And this was a simpler workflow.
Actually, I could suggest if people want to get into it in a simple way and learn it easily first, and then Blender sounds like it's got similar levels of complexity to Maya and other free software. Free on Google is Google SketchUp. It's free and it's really easy to use.
That's where I got started,
It does
actually.
exactly the same thing. This
Right.
does just on a simpler level. It doesn't do all the
You don't get the fancy textures or the lighting is different, but
If you learn SketchUp first, then going to Blender is a big jump.
especially if you haven't manipulated things in a virtual 3D space. SketchUp's a good place to start. Thank you.
Just go to Google.
Very good. Thank you all very much for coming. I have cards up here if you want to come grab one. If you forget the name of the website, go ahead and grab one. And thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.